Welcome everybody to our accessibility compliance presentation. I'm Marshall Butler, president of DiscoverTec. DiscoverTec is a 27-year-old Jacksonville-based company featuring 4 pillars of service. Those pillars are digital marketing, web development, design, and managed services. One of the areas that we've been building up recently and one of our core competencies is ADA compliance. Joining us today is Sheena Salmon. Sheena is a DiscoverTec senior digital strategist, and she is truly an accessibility expert. She is a senior trusted tester certified by the Department of Homeland Security, as well as an internationally certified accessible document specialist, and one of the first 50 recipients of this certification. With that, let's go ahead and dive in. I have to say that in my 25 plus years now in the business, there has never been a more significant shift that I've seen in the digital world than accessibility compliance for websites and apps. This is one of the most significant growth areas right now, and it's something that every single business should be focused on in some way as you look to the future. And we're going to cover a lot of ground today, and there's a lot of information, so we're going to keep it moving along as much as we can. But here's a quick preview of what we'll discuss when we say accessibility compliance, ADA compliance. What exactly are we talking about? What do we mean when we say that? We'll also talk about why it matters, why you should care, and why it's important to you. We'll cover aspects of the law to begin understanding what is required if you are compliant, how do you know, how can you tell, and then what to do about it if you aren't compliant. Then lastly, we'll talk about costs, and we'll go through some real-world examples and tools that we use in our own business to give you all a framework of an understanding of the options as well as steps that you can take to go down the right path. So what is classified as a disability? Let's look at this in a little more detail. First, there is the visual aspect. Visual disabilities, most people when they think of accessibility compliance just think of people who are completely blind. But others have limited vision, degrees of blindness, even color blindness that qualifies as a disability. Speech, you can be entirely without speech or have limited use of language. Anything in that range is considered part of a speech disability. Motor skills are considered limited motor function, even limitations with reach or strength that might make it difficult for someone to potentially use a mouse. That's a common occurrence that we see, especially those that have tremors, for example. Our next category is hearing. We're not just talking about someone that is completely deaf. There are hard of hearing folks, which also qualifies as a disability. And then our last one is cognitive disabilities. These could be learning disabilities, people who suffer from seizures, and persons who may have suffered a traumatic brain injury. This category is in fact one of the most difficult to account for in terms of accessibility and making websites compliant. Still, they represent a very real segment of the population with difficulty accessing, using, and interpreting websites. Now that we've talked about what a disability is, let's clarify what we're specifically talking about. Allowing users, regardless of their disability, equal access to all functionality and information on your website. But what does that mean? Everything a user interacts with, from forms to location information to online ordering that a non-disabled user can perform, must be available for a disabled user. Furthermore, it's allowing users, regardless of their disability, to use assistive technologies, specifically things like screen readers, braille terminals, and making your website usable for keyboard-only users. We'll explore assistive technologies in more detail later. Why should you care about accessibility compliance? Why is it important? Well, let's take a look. There are 3 big reasons to pay attention to web accessibility. Number 1, because the disabled are consumers and should be treated like any other customer. We'll take a closer look at the power and spending power of this audience. It also provides a better user experience. Something that is probably important to everyone attending this webinar is legal liability. If you are not compliant, you are opening yourself up to a lawsuit. If an attorney or someone with a disability finds your website inaccessible, then gets an attorney or a law firm, they could file a lawsuit against you for not being accessible. But let's go back to number one. The disabled are your customers. According to the CDC, as many as 1 in 4 adults in the US has some type of disability. That swath of the population shows that the disabled are your current customers, and they want to be able to research and shop online just like everyone else. This group represents tremendous spending power as well. The disabled are estimated to have about 490 billion with a B billion dollars in disposable income and more than 175 billion in discretionary spending. Reason number 2 is because it makes for a better user experience. There are many things to consider as we talk about user experience, like some of the more fringe areas you might not think about. A disability scenario might apply to some things like older persons who may need to be able to enlarge text on a screen. Some people are temporarily disabled due to an injury, such as a broken arm, for example. And some users are not disabled, but they may not be able to use screen or an audio function. This could include someone traveling on a bus or doing work around the house. They still need to be able to access information from a website or an app. This ultimately creates a better user experience, and it provides SEO, search engine optimization, benefits as well. Then reason number 3, and possibly the most important, is you could get sued. Over 2,250 federal lawsuits were filed in 2018 alone over accessibility compliance. This represents a 177% increase from 2017 to 2018. We're even seeing instances in which attorneys and law firms are filing suits in bulk to target entire industries and business types in one fell swoop, all hoping to issue you a demand letter with the hope that you'll settle out of court. Companies of all sizes have been affected. Some notable examples include companies with lawsuits filed against them are Home Depot, Domino's, Sephora. Florida, for example, is the third most targeted state in the country, right behind California and New York. These 3 areas are hotbeds for litigation for compliance lawsuits against companies that do not have accessible websites. And let's talk briefly about demand letters, because demand letters are a genuine threat. Typically, when you receive a demand letter, it will include the legal basis of the claim and the litigants filing the case. Frequently, they will provide you with a list of individual pages that are not compliant. They will include negotiation information providing you with the opportunity for a settlement, which is a scare tactic. They will provide you with information on a settlement for a certain sum, or if you reject the settlement offer, they may threaten a lawsuit. They also add a request for a response. I want to make this point very clear here and cannot stress this enough. If you should receive or have received a demand letter, you simply cannot ignore or hope it goes away. You are required to respond. The best course of action in this case is to seek an attorney. For context, a typical settlement starts at $16,000, not including the attorney fees. The threat from a demand letter is very real, and even small business owners can face the consequences. To further illustrate the issues, Sheena is going to share some real-world examples of recent lawsuits.
Thanks, Marshall, for all that info. The first case that we're going to talk about is one that I experienced personally while working for the parent company of Winn-Dixie, Southeastern Grocers. Before 2016, there weren't very many accessibility lawsuits in this country, and when there were, most companies decided that they would settle out of court instead of taking it to trial. Winn-Dixie, however, chose not to settle out of court and decided that they were going to take it to the courtroom. They were the first major company to actually make this decision, which turned out to be extremely costly for them. They were ultimately forced to pay over $100,000 in damages and spent an additional $250,000 to bring their website into compliance. This case was considered a landmark because it was the first time a judge sided against a company and cited for accessibility compliance in the digital sphere. So what happened to cause this lawsuit in the first place was a man named Juan Carlos Gil. He's legally blind, and he went to the Winn-Dixie website and attempted to refill his prescriptions, but found that he was unable to do so. He eventually contacted a lawyer. Gil and his lawyer went through the website to see what other things that they could not complete as they attempted to navigate the website. They tried to use the weekly ad and also found this functionality to not work with their assistive technologies. When they took them to court, the court decided that just because their digital and actual physical locations are not the same doesn't mean that it is not a place of public accommodations, and it should be treated as a place of public accommodation. So therefore, it was incompliant. It's also interesting to note that the inaccessible parts of the Winn-Dixie website were third-party plugins that were maintained by outside vendors and not by the Winn-Dixie company itself. Because they used third-party developers for this functionality and it was embedded in their site and it was non-compliant, Winn-Dixie was considered at fault and had to pay for all of the damages. Now we're going to look at another famous lawsuit. This one is from Dunkin' Donuts. This was a major accessibility lawsuit leveled against them by a man named Dennis Haynes, another blind individual. Haynes wanted to find a location nearby, but found that the store locator wasn't screen reader friendly. He eventually tried to purchase a gift card as well, and he found that he couldn't do that either. Dunkin' Donuts took it to court and unsuccessfully argued that there was no connection between their stores and their website under ADA guidelines, similar to the argument that Winn-Dixie had made. The court ultimately sided with Haynes and concluded that even though their goods and services were not tangible when they were online, their website was still a place of public accommodation and therefore still covered by the ADA. Dunkin' Donuts eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. So what are the federal laws? The current U.S. legislation for accessibility can be broken down like this. There are two sections of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the one that we're all familiar with. It was created back in the 1990s. It's the Rehabilitation Act, on the other hand, was created in 1973, which contains Section 508, which is an expansion of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. 508 serves as the information and communications arm of the Rehabilitation Act, but is specifically applied to the U.S. government, government contractors, educational institutions, basically any organization connected to the government. And then there is Title III, which is applied to the public in general, and everyone who has a web presence must comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So let's break down 508 a little more. As we mentioned in the previous slide, it was created as part of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act and later revised in 2010 to include all the information and communication technology, often abbreviated as ICT. 508 saw another major revision in 2018. This revision adopted all of the WCAG 2.0 standards with a few additional standards as well, which WCAG will go into more detail on the next slide. Initially, the guidelines created only applied to the government websites, as in federal government websites, and their information technology. But eventually it was expanded to any company working with the government, government contractors, and pretty much anything in the federal, state, or local government systems. So it's Title III. Title III is a part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. These standards were initially created in 1990 and revised in 2010 to expand upon the requirement to provide public accommodations for everyone. This change introduced accessibility for the web and not just for businesses with brick and mortar locations. Their websites were seen as public accommodations, as we mentioned in the Winn-Dixie and Dunkin' Donuts case, and meant to ensure that these ICT services did not cause an undue burden to any user or discriminate against the disabled. So what are the compliance standards? Accessibility standards are based on 4 pillars, which spell out the acronym POUR. The first pillar is perceivable, meaning that users can identify the content and user interface elements using their senses. The main ways of perception on the web are usually sight, sound, and/or touch. The second is operable. Operability means that the user can successfully use controls, buttons, navigations, and other interactive items that they need to operate or use your site in the same way as a non-disabled user. Some people interact with the web by clicking or tapping, and then other users just use a keyboard or voice commands. Third is understandable. Understandable users and their assistive technology should be able to comprehend what content is without any extra information or undue burden. Last, but certainly not least, is robust. meaning that it's designed to function on all appropriate technologies and assistive technologies and allows users to navigate a website successfully no matter what assistive technology they may need to use. As for the standards, there are two central bodies of standards. The first, Section 508, this is the federal guidelines for compliance, which we reviewed a little earlier. And then there's a more public-facing one that most people, or some people may be familiar with. It's WCAG, WCAG, which was created by the World Wide Web Consortium, or WC3 for short. The first version of these guidelines were created way back in 1999. The WCAG guidelines are considered the gold standards for all web compliance laws that exist today. WCAG 2.1 is broken down into 3 levels. So the first level is the lowest and basically your baseline. This is called single A compliance. These guidelines are considered to be the bare minimum. If you're currently working on your site, always prioritize any single A issue first. Next is double A compliance. This level of compliance is what everybody should strive to meet. It's basically what most industries are required to meet. It's a mid-tier level, and according to most accessibility laws, the standard. Finally, there's the highest level of compliance, which is called AAA compliance. This level is almost impossible for anyone to achieve across an entire website and is really kind of reserved for people who are more in specific industries like your money or your life, which we'll go into a little more detail in a minute. So who does Section 508 and WCAG or WCAG apply to? Section 508 specifically goes towards any government website of any kind, state, local, federal, educational institutions. AAA compliance goes for your money, your life categories, which are pretty much anything that has to deal with essential activities. So your banks, your healthcare, anything has to do with that. Nonprofits also have to meet at least AA with some AAA standards, and any business that is selling goods or services online is required to meet a level of AA compliance. And with that, Marshall is going to continue with some of the advantages of becoming ADA compliant.
Well, thank you, Sheena. That was a lot of information and a lot of acronyms there, and certainly a lot of legal information. But we do want to give you some more specifics and some actual examples of what you can do here. So let's dive into some of the advantages of ADA compliance. Two primary things here are SEO benefits to make your website ADA compliant. Things like quality page titles and correct heading structure are part of the foundation of making your site accessible, and they also make it incredibly accessible for assistive technology like screen readers. They also have an SEO benefit because they help make your website and your content easier to match and be crawled by searchers. They also, when we look at things like alt tags or images where screen readers may come through and try to identify an image with a description by reading the descriptive alt text for your image, you're not only providing an accessibility compliant element, but you're also making those images much more searchable. I think as we've all seen image searches across the web, they've become much more popular, especially with search engines offering separate indexes where they search images, and providing descriptive image alt text on these images can make those images much more searchable. Lastly, video transcripts, for example, can help with making videos more indexable and ultimately more searchable. Something that will appeal to almost everyone in the webinar are the actual tax benefits. Small businesses are eligible for up to a $5,000 tax credit for any website modifications that improve accessibility. Some improvements that may be covered would be fees for consulting services if you must hire someone to help test your website, to make it compliant, or to make modifications. Adaptive equipment or the modification of equipment that may be necessary for you to make your website or web properties compliant. And then the production of materials in accessible formats could mean things like PDF files, Word documents, and PowerPoint presentations, all part of your website. These additional documents need to be brought into compliance. But before you go down that path, we strongly recommend that you consult with your tax advisor to see what the benefits might be available to you. So, how do you know if you're accessibility compliant? Well, It begins with testing. That's the first place to start. But how exactly do you test for accessibility compliance? Well, there are free online tools that are available, and you can download them off the internet. There are browser plugins available, and even WebAIM offers a free online tool to assist with testing. But there's a caveat to this, and that is they will not test for everything. They are good for helping establish your current baseline, but again, they won't test for everything. You can also pay for third-party tools. Again, there's a caveat. They too will not test for everything. The simple truth of the matter is that there is no way around some sort of manual testing that has to be performed on a page-by-page basis if you want to have your website or app become completely accessibility compliant. Manual testing is an extensive process. Our testing, for example, tests across 20 different categories using up to 66 individual test criteria. We look at everything from images to forms to whether a website can successfully be navigated using only a keyboard. We also check video transcriptions and captioning to make sure that it meets accessibility compliance standards. And as we mentioned before, if you want to have complete testing on your website, it has to be done on a page-by-page basis. There are few options outside of a fully manual test. The most common compliance issue that we find is insufficient color contrast. This one is probably among the most common things that we see across websites. What do we exactly mean by color contrast issues? This means the foreground color, most often your text and background color. The highest degree of color contrast a website can get is black text on a white background. You need to have a background that meets the minimum standard of 4.5 to 1. This ratio is specified by both WCAG 2.1 and Section 508 compliance standards. Next is inadequate keyboard access and visual focus. As we talked about in the previous slide, keyboard access is essential, and it is part of our testing process, as well as part of the ADA compliance standard that a website has to be fully navigable by use of only a keyboard. And not only do you need to be able to use only a keyboard to access every single feature on your website, but as you tab across or use your arrow keys to get where you need to go, it has to follow a logical order. And you have to be able to see at all times what element you are focused on, and whether it's a border highlight or it's a highlight that brings us back to insufficient color contrast. If there's not enough contrast in that highlight to identify that element from the border to the background color, you could fail on two different levels. Number 3 is missing or poor alt text on images. As we talked about, this is a critical component unless your image is what we call a decorative image. You need to have some sort of description in what we call the alt text, which is basically a description of those images that allows a screen reader to pick them up and identify them as an image for visually impaired people. Number 4, meaningless link text is about the biggest one that we see everywhere. There's probably no website that doesn't say, click here or learn more somewhere on their website. Unfortunately, those are not descriptive enough. They do not convey enough meaning for someone that is disabled. Or maybe scanning your website with a screen reader. Those buttons or links need to have a description of what will happen when they interact with them. Then there are the videos or audio files that are not captioned. I do want to point out here, YouTube is very easy to embed videos on your website. And YouTube has an AI closed captioning button or feature that you may be able to use for your videos. However, that function still does not meet the full standard on its own. You must review the AI captions to ensure that they are synced correctly and that the captions match what is being seen in the video. So, what should you do to get compliant? I'm now going to turn it over to Sheena again to run you through some accessibility options.
Thanks, Marshall. So here is what we recommend to get your website compliant. The first thing you're going to have to do is make a commitment to becoming accessibility compliant. After that, you're going to need to start establishing your baseline goals and what level of accessibility you're going to strive for. This is really based on your industry, so you need to look into that first. And then how quickly you want to become compliant. Then you're going to want to start creating guidelines for your website or app. This will help your team and people who come behind you and add content to your website. If people don't know how to name things, then that's going to be a problem. So establishing these guidelines are very important. Everything going forward that you create, you don't have to keep redoing over and over again. Then you're going to want to decide whether or not you want to use a browser-based tool, which can serve as a bridge gap until you've actually met full compliance on your website, or as close to full compliance as you can. Becoming accessibility compliant is not instant. It does take a lot of time and dedication, so get started as soon as you can. One of the first steps you can do is to provide an accessibility compliance statement, and it will also show to the world that you are actively doing something to move towards accessibility compliance. All right, so making a commitment to becoming compliant and allowing equal access to your website and creating an equal experience for everyone regardless of abilities. An often overlooked subset of the population when we're talking about accessibility are people with temporary disabilities. So people who have just maybe had surgery on their hands, or people who need larger text to read your website. My mom, for example. I think that a lot of moms use the giant text tool on their cell phones. So you should make a commitment to prevent you and your company from being levied with a demand letter by making sure that these people can also access your website the same way as everyone else. Then you need to establish your baselines and goals for compliance. Determining your level of compliance depends a lot on your industry, as I've said. The lowest level is single A compliance, which everyone should strive to meet, but double A compliance is pretty much the level that you need to avoid any potential legal issues. If your company falls into a category like your money or your life, like we mentioned earlier, triple A compliance is where you should be heading. It's always a good idea to have somebody around who's knowledgeable in standards to help you see and prevent any issues and identify potential barriers for access to your website. Then once you've identified what needs to be fixed, you'll need to prioritize them based on what you can easily do and what's going to need additional time and resources. It's best to work on the areas where you don't meet single A level of compliance first, and then moving up to higher tiers from there. Setting up your guidelines to help your team maintain accessibility, you'll need to set up processes and potentially maybe have training for your team on a few different issues that you can quickly address and add to your guidelines. Some things that you can look at are things like image alt text, links and how you name them, buttons and how to name those as well. You can also need to make accessibility a priority. If you need additional help or advice, we can help you out. We're here for anything that you need or your business needs to help you develop your processes and guidelines, and we can also provide ongoing support for your team. Creating a compliance statement for your website is a key piece of getting compliant. A compliance statement needs to clearly outline the way your business is following compliance guidelines, and it also needs to outline known issues and what you're doing to correct them. So if you receive a demand letter, you can show your compliance statement as proof that you've begun the process of bringing your website into compliance and show what progress you have made towards becoming compliant. We strongly encourage you to make this a top priority and use this as a first step when setting up your accessibility program. But the single most important thing that you can do is to get started right now, because building an accessible website takes time to accomplish. There are a lot of moving parts, steps, and guidelines that need to be sorted through, and a compliant website is not going to happen overnight. But starting sooner rather than later can help prevent you from having a target placed on your back and potentially receiving a demand letter. Web accessibility can be complicated and confusing, but don't worry, we're here to help. We offer a wide range of accessibility services that can help you become compliant. So here is the quick overview of what we offer. First, we do audits and accessibility testing. We provide you with an easy to digest and understand documentation so you can see what and where your issues are. Second, we offer monitoring services. We use automated software and manual testing to continually monitor your website for accessibility errors. And finally, we offer remediation services for issues that are occurring on your website at the code level. Our audits and testing come in three varieties that are tailored to fit your needs and your budget. The first is the Discover Test, which is a full audit of your website based on the guidelines required for your industry or business. Once we've completed our audit, we will provide you with a comprehensive list of recommendations for issues that you or your team can implement. The second is a simpler audit. It's a test for the most burdensome issues for users and issues that companies most often get targeted for. You can also have the option to have your entire website audited against these criteria or just a few of your most trafficked pages, just like our classic test. We'll provide you with the detailed list of issues. However, remediation recommendations are not included in this package. And finally, we have Discover Test Docs. This audit focuses exclusively on digital documents that you have on your website, including PDFs, Word, Excel, anything pretty much digital and Microsoft based with the addition of PDFs. We will then provide you with the specifics of the failures of these documents and what you need to fix and where. Performing an audit offers a one-time snapshot of where your website is in terms of compliance. However, websites are rarely static, and hopefully are not, and continually grow and change, which is why we offer two types of ongoing monitoring. The first is DiscoverTec, which monitors your website at the frequency of your choosing, so monthly, quarterly, or annually, whichever fits your team's needs the best. Then we offer the DiscoverTec Plus. You'll get all of the same features as the regular DiscoverTec monitoring, but with the added bonus of ongoing monthly maintenance, or one of our accessibility experts will go in and make fixes for you that don't require back-end code changes, and go through and make updates to any known issues that have popped up or have existed for a little while. We offer several options for the amount of time you would like for us to spend each month on making these edits for you to accommodate you and your budget and your needs. We will also maintain your records ongoing, so you can monitor the progress of your website and know where you are in any situation in case something arises where you need to prove your accessibility efforts. Finally, we offer remediation services for compliance errors that require a little more of a deep dive into your code. For this, we offer three basic remediation options, which cover things like CSS changes and header hierarchy. Then we have advanced remediation, which can include back-end code changes for things like skip navigation, implementation, visual focus indication, tab order, form functionality, and other deeper level code fixes. And lastly, we offer document remediation, which covers fixes to your digital documents, so your PDFs, Excels, PowerPoints, and Word documents, so that you can be sure no matter what type of document you have on your website, you're certain it's in compliance.
Wow, Sheena, that was a ton of information and some really great suggestions to help people understand what does it mean to be accessibility compliant, why do they need to be accessibility compliant, and the benefits of being accessibility compliant. Plus, of course, all the ways that we can help folks with any of these compliance levels here at DiscoverTec. We, as Sheena mentioned, offer a wide variety of services and can assist. So please reach out to us. We can certainly get you set up and on your journey towards AA or AAA compliance, depending on your industry. And we would love to talk to you. Please reach out to us and look forward to speaking with you soon.